Hello and welcome to the Good Society Forum. My name is Emma Skye and I'm Director of Yale World Fellows and co-host of the Good Society Forum. The Good Society Forum is a community of change makers around the world with a common quest to build the good society. My co-host is Nizama Dean of the Prince's Trust and a 2019 Yale World Fellow. Niz.
Thanks, Emma. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for what is actually our 11th webinar. We don't know where the time has gone, but we know it's been an incredible journey so far. We've had some phenomenal webinars. We've had some brilliant participants and attendees, and we're so excited that our community keeps growing. And each of you is committed to building the good society, so thank you. Please consider following us on Twitter at GoodSoc Forum. We have a LinkedIn page and we are also on Facebook. We are constantly looking for ideas around our Good Society Forum sessions. If you have an idea or wish to be a panelist also, please do consider emailing us info@goodsocietyforum.com. So the plan for today, as is now convention, we're going to hear from our speakers. We have 4 today on our theme. And then we will take your questions. So if you do have any questions, any comments, any feedback, we encourage you to share them throughout, and we will curate them towards the end, having collated them. We're very keen for you to participate, and I can see already that a lot of our friends who've been joining our webinars know the tradition of what we do now, which is we try and find out where everybody is from. So if you wouldn't mind, and you know the drill, if you can use your chat function so that we can test it to make sure it's working for you, just let us know where you are currently in the world, what city and what country. Amazing. So we have Azim from Kyrgyzstan, Bishkek, I should say, thank you for joining us. We have Akua from Accra in Ghana. We have DJ from Belgium. We have Rana from Palestine, part of the EcoPeace family. Thank you. Suzanne from New York. We have Heather from Larchmont in New York. Seb, thanks for joining us from London. We have Sultan Al-Qasimi, a 2018 World Fellow from Sharjah, UAE. I feel the pressure now, Sultan, because we know you have these amazing webinars yourself. So thank you for joining us. We have Damola from Lagos in Nigeria, Amjad Salim from Geneva in Switzerland. Thank you for joining us. Sunny, Prestwick, Scotland. Malcolm, thank you. We have Bill from London. We have George from Guwahati in India. Thank you. Leila from Mexico. Valentina from Paris. Hoa from Turin, Italy. My God, there are places here that we definitely haven't seen. So we know we are continuing to grow our family of Good Society Forum participants. And just to be clear, by taking part, you're now part of the family. So there's no going back. There's no backsies. Bushra, thank you for joining us from London, a head teacher and the CEO of a number of schools across London. My God, I'll stop now. So Emma, what are we talking about today?
Well, the pandemic has caused schools to close in the middle of the academic year, but teachers and students haven't stopped working. They've transitioned to virtual classrooms, and this has not been without challenges. We've got the technology to teach classes virtually, but many students don't have a computer or access to the internet or a calm home. So this means very different opportunities to continue learning. A classroom, in a way, creates a level playing field and is an equalizer. And without it, inequalities are increasing, and organic interactions between teachers and students are lost. And it's hard to stay focused staring at a computer screen. So today we're going to explore whether efforts to transition to virtual learning have been successful, or have these past few months been lost for students? Now, some schools have physically reopened, but in others, teachers and students remain uncertain when they'll be back in the same physical space. How can we better prepare for education in a post-COVID world? Now, our first guest is Dennis Misner, was the executive director of Lemon Foundation in Brazil, which strives to make Brazil a more just and equitable country by guaranteeing access to high-quality public education for Brazilians of all backgrounds. Dennis was previously founder and executive director of Instituto Sor da Paz, a leading Brazilian NGO focused on violence prevention, and is also a 2007 Yale World Fellow. Dennis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Emma and Nizam, for organizing this fantastic Good Society Forum and to give me connected to the Yale World Fellows community and to the larger community around us. As Emma said, we are facing many impacts of the pandemic in our daily lives. Of course, there is the health issue, the economic issue, the political issue in many of our countries, including the US and Brazil. But we also have an educational crisis. And this educational crisis, as everything else with the pandemic, is really increased by the inequality that is present in our day-to-day lives, but apparently it becomes more visible when we're facing the same kind of crisis all over the world. In Brazil, the Lemon Foundation has been moving quickly over the past 6-7 weeks to organize a response to the COVID challenge in education and put together a civil society coalition to offer some hope to school districts and schools in how they could be able not to leave the kids without any kind of learning happening. 85% of the kids in Brazil are in public schools, like many of your countries, and the 15% who aren't are in private schools, and most private schools are just moving to Zoom, moving to other platforms, and trying to keep the learning going. But in general, the norm at public schools would be to completely stop the learning and wait for the crisis to pass. And we thought, as many others, as many school district leaders, that this would be unacceptable at the scale that this epidemic was coming and at the length that is taking in countries like Brazil, where we have been in lockdown or some sort of social distancing for the past 75 days, and schools have been closed for over 2 months already, and there's not a clear path to reopen them. So I think there are many issues to cover here, but I wanted to focus that there were 2 initiatives that seemed to be very important. One was to rapidly organize around the national learning standards in Brazil and focus, understand what could be the main focus, what are the key competencies that students need to develop in this school year. And Brazil has a national learning system which really helps in terms of focusing and understanding, and then organizing content and teacher preparation and support for teachers to teach this content from a distance. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be feasible to imagine every school, every public school moving online as the private schools did, but there were some system solutions that were put in place that now are showing some interesting and positive results. One of them was just organizing all the learning in a specific app and make this app free of charge for the users. Not only the cost of the app, of course, but the use of data on their data plans. A lot of the most affected students are on prepaid cell phones, or their parents have connectivity, but it's a prepaid connectivity, and they simply can't afford to use their data plans to pay for their kids' education for long hours a day. So in a negotiation with the telcos and with the school districts, were able to pay for the data, and the students were able to use this for free. Solutions like that have reached, just in the state of Sao Paulo, where we're based, 2.4 million students regularly. That's 82% of the students in the state, over 90% of students in several other states in Brazil, and we're in line to reach about 10 million students studying online through this solution. The other solution that might work in other countries around the world where connectivity is still an issue, like Brazil, or even a bigger issue than Brazil, which is offering classes by TV. So we've put together 4 hours of TV program every day, focused on every age group and focused on the learning standards in the country, seeing part of existing content and content that is taught live by teachers in the different districts around the country. And this TV content is made available through several TV stations who are opening their broadband to offer that to students. So that's another solution that seemed interesting. The last point, and I'll close this first presentation, is we really need to get ready for when the classes come back. Schools need to be supported in order to be able to successfully implement a plan to keep the kids healthy, but also the learning going. And some of the main issues there, and I'll just cover two. One is being able that we have the correct diagnostic tools so we can know in these very strange times where each student is when they come back to class. And then that we have a very strong remediation program that we can help the kids who the fact to really come to need technology, not only while the pandemic, help schools count with the support of technology afterwards, and will make countries prioritize connectivity and teacher preparation for the use of technology as a leverage for student learning. So this is my, just give you some vision on the situation in Brazil, and happy to participate in the debate.
Dennis, fantastic start. Thank you so much for providing that context. So our next speaker is Dr. Emiliana Vegas, Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. Emiliana has written extensively on issues affecting education systems in Latin America and the Caribbean, as well as other developing regions, has served for 7 years as a Chief of Education Division at the Inter-American Development Bank previously, as well as having worked at the World Bank. Emiliana, we are very lucky to have you. Hopefully you will be prompted to join us. Fantastic. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation. It's really a pleasure to be part of this interesting forum and to have so many participants from all over the world. I'd like to speak about how the school closures that have taken place all over the world may impact inequality. And I'm basing my remarks on a recent report that I produced called School Closures and Inequality, and it's in our website, where I use data that was collected quickly by another institution here in Washington called the Center for Global Development, and combined it with data on income levels by country from the World Bank, and also looked at countries that have participated in the Program for International Student Assessment of the OECD, which is, as many of you may know, the largest international assessment of student learning that takes place every 3 years around the world. So I'll just start by saying that less than 25% of low-income countries are currently providing any type of remote learning. The majority, as Dennis mentioned, are using TV and radio. And this is in contrast to high-income countries where over 90% of them are providing remote learning opportunities, nearly all online. Now we know that online is not necessarily a perfect substitute for in-person teaching, but it certainly presents opportunities for a much more dynamic interaction than do TV and radio, or nothing at all, which is what's happening in many of the poorest countries of the world. And when we look at that by region of the world, Sub-Saharan Africa really stands out as the region that is able to offer the least remote learning opportunities to its students. So a big concern that we have is that inequalities across countries will grow. But we also know that within countries, and Brazil is an example, Dennis was mentioning how the differences between private and public schools are playing out. But it's true that in all countries, including the wealthy countries of the world, there are differences between the resources that more advantaged and more disadvantaged students have. And so that's something also that we have to keep in mind as we see the impact of these closures on student learning. One thing I wanted to say is we know from the literature that teachers are perhaps the most important factor in student learning. So we also looked in our study to see, in light of the school closures, what is going on with with regards to teacher support. And we know that, school closures happened in many countries overnight, there was little in place to be able to move to a completely online education system. And one thing we found is that there's a big difference also by region and income level. For example, between 20 and 30% of countries in East Asia and the Pacific and Europe and Central Asia and in South Asia are combining guidance, providing guidance to teachers as well as online training. But these numbers are much lower in the Middle East and North Africa and in Latin America and the Caribbean, where they're at most 18% of them are providing some sort of training to teachers. And in sub-Saharan Africa, again, we note that there's really very few countries, if any, that are providing training. Another thing to note, and this was mentioned before, is that access to internet is not as widespread in many parts of the world. So even if the countries are making efforts to provide online education and online training to teachers, in many of the low-income countries, access to internet in households is less than 20%, for example. So what do we conclude from this? We conclude that COVID will have huge impacts on student learning across the world, but students in low-income countries and in sub-Saharan Africa will be the most negatively affected. And in middle and in high-income countries with broad internet access, and interestingly, we noticed that in PISA participating countries, the impact on student learning will depend more on the quality of teaching and learning taking place remotely. We noticed that in the PISA participating countries, even those who are low-income countries are offering high proportions of online and remote learning opportunities. And we hypothesize that this is because countries are willing to assess themselves in assessments such as PISA, are keen on improving their learning outcomes, and therefore are investing more in ensuring that the school closures do not imply that no learning takes place. We also understand that the learning gap between rich and poor will likely grow during the pandemic, not just between high and low income countries, but also between high and low income regions and communities within countries. And although we don't have yet a lot of information on this, we do know from past pandemics and past crises that girls and migrant and refugee populations will be at greater risk. Now, in a separate study, we did some very quick analysis of what would be the lasting impacts of the learning loss. And this is work that I did with colleagues, former colleagues from the World Bank, Harry Petrinas and George Sakharopoulos, and Victoria Collis. And I just wanted to say that we estimated very quickly what would be the loss in earnings resulting from the learning loss in the school closures periods in the US. Basically, we built in previous work that has shown that every additional year of schooling amounts to 9% of additional future earnings. And then we used the number of months of closures in the United States to estimate loss in marginal future earnings. So for example, we assume that in the US, schools and universities are closed for 4 months, and therefore the loss in marginal future earnings would be 2.5% per year over a student's working life. And we apply this assumption to the United States, which is the largest economy in the world, and it's 76 million students who are now in primary, secondary, and higher education. And what we found is that at the individual earning, each student can expect to lose about $1,337 per year. And that implies a present value loss of earnings over the lifetime of each student of $33,000 and some. Although these figures don't seem to be so huge at the individual level, when we actually add them up for the entire country, the amount is $2.5 trillion. So we see this as an indication that these school closures will have lasting impacts on the cohorts of today's students, but also on the productivity and wealth of our countries. Thank you.
So Miliana, thank you very much for sharing those insights, really fascinating. And our third speaker is Raymond Ravaglia, who is the Chief Learning Officer for Opportunity Education, where he's developing innovative learning models and building new schools. He's the founder of the Stanford University Online High School, a former Associate Dean and Director of Stanford Pre-Collegiate Studies, a founding director of pre-college at the School of New York Times, and Vice Chairman of Dwight Global. Ray, thank you for joining us.
It's absolutely my pleasure to be here today. What's been ironic about the experience that we've had over the last 4 to 6 months is I spent the first 30 years of my career focusing on complete online instructional solutions, building online schools. And when I left that activity 4 or 5 years ago, the focus was on how to take more advantage of using the technology to facilitate place-based education and to actually have students working together at physical classes. That said, we've always sought to use the technology to provide a seamless thread that would run through the education and allow the experience of students to be shifted from education as something being caused by the instructors to really focus on the fact that education is something that is occurring always and everywhere for students, and it really is a question of how to support that and how to put students in charge of their learning. When we saw the pandemic spreading in late January, early February, we looked at how could we go from, we were working in 3 schools, one in Santa Rosa, California, one in Omaha, Nebraska, one in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The question was, how could we move seamlessly from having the students come on campus to do their learning to a world where they would have to be learning from home? Now, it's obviously when one is designing a purely online school, one approaches it very differently than one looks at how to temporarily address a break in in-person learning. In particular, when you're thinking about an online school, you really need to worry not just about the core academic curriculum being delivered, but about all of the types of incidental learning that occur in school. And in particular, when you think about the experience of students in different spaces, the way students relate to each other in class while the teacher is there is very different than how they relate sort of in the classroom before the teacher arrives, is different from how they relate to each other in the school commons, is different from how they relate to each other when they're outside of school waiting for the bus, is different from how they relate to each other at the cafe across the street, which is different than how they relate at the cafe downtown. So the students are used to having a variety of very different spaces where they can do different degrees of social experimentation, different degrees of relationship building. And when those are wiped out suddenly and students are at home, even when you provide a rich video-based set of interactions, you're typically only capturing one of those dimensions. And it becomes stressful over time, and that stress continues to mount as students find that things they were never aware that they had, they suddenly notice their absence. What we've been looking to do as we had our shift to online is for the current year, really, it was a question of how do we make it so that all students can connect online and we can continue the learning that was intended for this year. And the fact that we were taking a project-based approach that put a large premium on students having control of their own learning and responsibility for their own learning made it natural to shift them out of a context where a teacher is watching them to a context where they were responsible for continuing that learning. We did use video classrooms to bring them together to provide opportunities to connect with each other and with the instructor. We were very aware of the fact that not all of our students had adequate technology at home. We supply all of the students Chromebooks normally for school, but we had to supply about 20% of our students with wireless hotspots that would allow them to continue to connect from home. As we look to the fall, the question really becomes, how can we provide a seamless experience that could allow students to, that would work as well if everyone is at home, if everyone is in the classroom, if small numbers of students are being cycled through the classroom on a low density basis, if there are individual students whose parents feel uncomfortable with allowing them to return to the classroom, so they want to stay at home and connect. So how do we refactor the experience to allow all of those partial types of interaction to really sort of do away with the notion of physical space, but to accommodate a wide variety of physical spaces. And also to do that in a way that not only will be relevant during the pandemic, but can address many of the other problems that schools often experience, whether it's disruption of service for natural disasters. In Santa Rosa, California, our school there has been closed for 2 to 3 weeks in 2 of the last 3 years due to fires. In Omaha, there's routine for schools to be closed during snow. The feeling is once we have a seamless system that allows students to be either physically present or electronically present at school and in class, we can really lean heavily into that to allow that model to really start dominating the core experience of education, so that we can use this opportunity to really shift to something that loosens the notions of physical co-presence as something required for effective education to happen. Look forward to the discussions today.
Ray, thank you for your contribution there, and look forward to bringing you back very shortly. So up next we have, just going to make sure we should work. Fantastic. So up next we have Nav Iqbal, Principal and CEO of GEMS Metropole School in Dubai. Nav has over a decade's worth of experience in school leadership roles in the UK and in the United Arab Emirates, having previously had a successful career in banking and as an entrepreneur. Nav, thank you for joining us. We're really excited to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Nizam. Thank you for inviting me here to speak and share some of my thoughts, and actually listening to what so far has been a very insightful learning opportunity. I'm always a teacher first, so I'm always a student as well, so I like to learn as well. Hello colleagues, hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. As Nizam mentioned, my name is Nav Iqbal, and I'd like to begin by saying I don't claim to be an authority, so everything I do say is based on my humble experience as a school principal and CEO of a significantly large school, only 3,000 students, which is part of a wider network, GEMS Education, which is one of the global players, if you will, in terms of education. So I come from that particular part. My school is operating in the United Arab Emirates. I know some colleagues are here from Sharjah. So mine itself is in Dubai. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But before I begin, I'd like to start with the fact that one of the questions that always get asked, depends on whether you're in banking or any type of industry or even education, is around change management. And I find it quite interesting that when this call came through for our schools in Dubai or in the UAE, it was less than a week's notice, in which it was a case of, okay, going from in-school, bricks and mortar learning, if you will, to virtual or online or distance learning, whatever name you want to give it. And that was done within less than 5 working days. And I found that quite powerful, that having, and I guess it comes down to necessity can be the mother of all invention. And I'm proud to say that in Dubai, speaking to many different schools, many schools were able to transition quite seamlessly and effectively. There was an element of training. However, a lot of the applications used, I'm not going to mention any, but there are many out there. Many of the teachers and the schools were already well trained because virtual learning was already a part of the schools. It just became more of a part, and it became the main driver, the main vehicle, if you will. Colleagues have spoken about learning itself. Just looking at it from an engagement point of view, in my school, the attendance typically is around 95% when it's in school, and the attendance online was around 93%. At the moment, my attendance is 94%. So many students, in fact, are still engaging online. It depends on demography again, depends on the tier of the type of school or where it actually is. As, for example, Emiliana mentioned as well, in terms of deprivation, poverty index, and all of these kind of things. In our particular case, we did have some parents who required internet connection or devices, which we were fortunate enough, being a mid-market plus school, if you will, to be able to provide them. But generally speaking, we didn't have those barriers. And I use the word barrier because one of the things GEMS we were able to do is we were able to look at barriers as opportunities and try to be change makers, early adopters, if you will. So this was something that was done to us, but it doesn't necessarily need to be that we are having to band-aid something over and try to find, as you know, a kind of a substitution or a supplement to supplement education, and we come back to school and then we'll pick up the pieces. That was not our mindset. The mindset was, how can we best adapt and adopt under the circumstances to go and transition over to online learning and try to ensure it's as seamless as possible. Why? Because one of the things that we noticed was there was a lot of fear and anxiety. Social media did not help with this. Our news outlets or TV did not support this. So when parents are anxious, and rightfully so, looking at the economics of it, looking at job cuts, pay cuts, etc., safety concerns, children see, children do. Now, coming from an educator point of view, my priority at the chalk face was my children, to ensure that they are not anxious in times of uncertainty, in times of a pandemic. So what we aim to do is try to transition what we call virtual metropole by transitioning and segueing as a virtual school. So we didn't water down our curriculum. We didn't reduce the days. We tried to ensure that there was plenty of live teaching taking place where the teacher was online delivering lessons. And of course, we improved week by week in terms of this, just so the children, whether that be a 3-year-old or whether that be a 15-year-old, a young person, they can see the mentors, their teachers, whom they probably spend, I would argue, most of the time, in some cases more than the parents themselves. And by doing this, and we surveyed our students, we surveyed our parents, and we took that feedback, we took research, we took primary, secondary information in order to be able to adapt and try to be that change maker itself. And I will just, I'm sure there'll be opportunity to talk a little bit more. Forward thinking means scenario-based planning, looking at what is to come in September. But the two key points from me, and I'll pass over to you again, Nizam, is that communication and transparency in terms of communication was so important to alleviate the anxiety of our parents and our students. And secondly, something that I'm really passionate about and really important now and in the future was the socio-emotional aspects of our students. This doesn't only affect their learning, it affects their self-esteem. We are all social interactors, and we want them to be able to transition from this times of hardship, if you will, and gain something from it. So well-being of our staff members and our students were really important, and we focused heavily on that. And we had a lot of conversations about that. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight, but I'm proud to say we were, when I say we, GEMS Education and many schools in Dubai, in all honesty, were able to be at the forefront and try to ensure we try to get the best opportunity in these times. Thank you, Nizam.
Nav, thank you so much. And that context, the institutional context, is incredibly beneficial. So I'm just going to invite Ray, Emiliana, and Dennis back so that we can go into this Q&A segment. And I can already see we've had loads of questions coming through, loads of comments coming through, so we will sift through them. The first thing I wanted to just quickly ask, and I think, Dennis, you've alluded to it, Emiliana, you've alluded to it, which is the measures taken in terms of a lockdown and the measures of social distancing, of course, have been for the benefit of all citizens. Now, we've heard that some of them have consequences to young people. So do you feel in your country context enough has been done to ensure the standards of education and the quality of learning is appropriate despite the emergency measures? And maybe could share some of the good practice, because we have a lot of practitioners who are with us. So if there's stuff that you can share around that, specifically how we've maintained standards of quality and standards of learning, I think that would be brilliant. And I'm asking within your context of your research, of your field. So if I could maybe start with Dennis, actually.
Sure. Thanks for that, and thanks all the other panelists for a lot of very interesting learning. My sense is that it's incredibly hard to provide at the same time to respond to the urgency of the pandemic and keep high-level quality instruction going on and quality interaction. So I think there were some learnings. I think one key thing was this idea of creating what a tool called the focus map. And the focus map is, it would be great if we could do like the experience from Dubai and a lot of the private schools, would just keep life as usual and transition to this new normal. But that's not like feasible for large, like 40 million school systems, like 40 million student school systems. So I think part of it is really picking up and deciding, being intentional about providing the most critical part of the curricula and not letting that to choice and to chance. The second part is a lot of school districts wanted to create their own content, and it makes sense, but it's hard for teachers to learn how to be a teacher online, to broadcast. It's hard to put together studios to tape the teachers. So, you know, leverage some of the resources that are already available, that we know are high quality, that were not designed in like snap of the moment with low resources and in times of urgency. So we did a lot in terms of this, putting together this like 4 hours of learning for every day, for every school grade, and combining like a little bit of the traditional instruction from that district, from that school, but also using some sort of content that was already available online and of high quality. I think a lot of places already have high quality content, either produced by the schools or by YouTube or by some of the players in EdTech. So I think that's another part of it. The third part is communication, and this was mentioned before. It's critical to communicate well with parents and explain what's going on and communicate with the students. So when it was not possible to move to a traditional, like a platform like Google Classrooms or some other sort of learning platform, we encourage teachers to create WhatsApp groups with their students and to kind of go over. And in these apps that were created, there was always room, even if the class was the same for several thousands of students, you could create your classroom inside the app, and you could communicate and you know, deal with kind of the main doubts and difficulties that kids are having. There were also some experiences in terms of encouraging teachers to call their students every like few weeks. And I think that's really important to kind of understand what's going on inside the homes. Unfortunately, one of the biggest problems in this pandemic is what's going on inside in terms of abuse, in terms of domestic violence, that we're not being able. Teachers are great spotters of these problems in regular times. So it's really important. So these are just some of the issues.
Right. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we're going to come to some of those. Emiliana, if I could ask you the same question, and perhaps from a systemic perspective, what you've seen in terms of this agenda.
Yeah, I think that, to be very honest, I think what we've seen is what one would call not remote learning, but emergency education, you know, and as we all know that with very few exceptions, schools were not prepared to go fully online practically overnight or with 5 working days at most to prepare. Teachers were not prepared, and students as well, you know, where their whole routines were disrupted. My hope is that, you know, that, and I think we are seeing a lot of creative solutions in an emergency situation. Dennis mentioned a number of them. I've seen a lot of EdTech companies providing resources for free, a lot of, you know, really goodwill and creativity, but it's an emergency mode. I do hope that when we do have the opportunity to go back to a physical education setting, that there will be a lot of learnings from this process and a lot of ways in which technology actually did aid interactions, did facilitate learning, and also a lot of preparation by schools and teachers and families to be ready to engage in another batch of school closures, as we don't have a vaccine, and if it is developed, it may not be widely available and distributed, you know, to all instantly. So I think this will be a new normal, and I do hope that also that technology and education will finally be able to kind of do that promise that it had always had of accelerating learning and really complementing the work of teachers. And we have seen that it hadn't happened. So maybe all this will have a silver lining in the end, but I don't think right now we have, you know, great experiences yet.
Amina, thank you. And also you can tell we have attendees who are academics and tutors, because The length of the comments are fantastic. So I'm just about keeping up. So keep them coming. Nav, I'm going to come to you now, if I may, and then Ray will come to you later. So you've outlined what you've been able to do. So I want to bring up the question I've just asked in terms of how do you ensure the standards and especially the quality learning experience. And then Aqua has asked the question, which is what you've done is commendable, but is it because there was an existing or pre-existing infrastructure arrangement to make it possible? How would you advise, and maybe Ray, this is something for you to consider as well, how can we take care of countries without this infrastructure? And then, and if I can now, just to try and get more questions in, can you be specific about how you have supported teachers professionally and personally? You're on mute. There we go, please.
Okay, thank you for the question. In terms of how we transitioned, and just to be totally honest with you, we, for example, historically in this school use Google Classroom, and I transitioned within 24 hours from that over to Microsoft Teams. I'm not plugging, I'm just telling you what we did as a school. Now, teachers were provided with professional development initially. Obviously, you have to be IT literate, and a lot of the features, whether you're using Google Teams or anything else, are very, very similar. It's not that. It's a case of what you do with these tools, whether that be any type of online application or whether that be a scientific calculator, if you will. The craft is in how you use what is available to you. So no, you can do it. But my only advice, and I saw some colleagues and participants mentioning about, so what is the best solution? The answer is, it depends, and my advice will be whatever is best for your school community and your demography, not even your country, because I might do it differently to my school compared to one across the road. Depends on the needs of the particular school community itself. So my advice will be to really speak out, reach out, communicate. Like Dennis mentioned, ask the questions, see what is available, quality assure, audit, understand, and then make a well-informed decision. Why did I transition over to Teams? Because I took this opportunity because I was going to transition to that in 6 months' time. So I brought it earlier. So my school improvement as a leader, I'm still on that timeline, okay? How did we support teachers? By ensuring they had all the means necessary to be able to do what they do best, which is to ensure our children learn, our young people learn. Communicating with them. We have a lot of teachers who are, well, all of them are expats in all honesty, but many of them whom are here by themselves without their family. So their well-being was very important to us. So we earmarked those teachers who may be vulnerable and made those calls, those buddy calls to see what they needed and supported them. And we had a lot of well-being for parents, teachers, staff members, and students as well. So these are some of the examples of what we had to do, but we kept learning every single week. We didn't say, right, okay, this is, for example, we didn't take the approach of it's an emergency and we have to do whatever, all hands on deck. We thought, okay, we need to transition best way possible. How can we improve it? What is our community saying? What have we learned? How can we improve? And we did that. So for example, again, depends on your needs. We're moving over now from, Puente Dura's SAMR model from substitution down to augmentation. So we're actually bringing in augmented reality and gamification in our primary school just to bring in there. So some of our year 10 and 11 students visited the White House virtually because we had to get them to do a school trip. So we didn't cancel school trips. All we did is we took school trips online, our assembly. So the routines are really important to keep them going. Now that might be different depending on your resources and your surroundings, your economic factors, but you can still do it if the will is there to do it.
Nav, thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll have loads of comments coming through about availability of resource and maybe hopefully something practical that might come out of this is the ability for us to share good practice. So Ray, the same question to you, and also thanks to Monica for that teacher question that Nav has just answered. Ray, if I come to you now, asking a very similar question, and please do pick up on what you wish to answer from what we've heard so far. Casey has asked an important question here, and you've mentioned contexts where it might be difficult to have resources sometimes. From your experience of online learning in particular, are some physical resources such as paper, books, etc., being provided to children to be able to engage in their education, even if they're unable to be taught by teachers?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this is going to come down to, each institution is going to need to figure out what its goals are, both what its goals were prior to the emergency and then what its goals become after the emergency. And when we're looking at the curriculum and what we're trying to cover, we may decide that because we're losing some of the efficiencies of being in a physical classroom, we are not going to try to cover as much material, but we still want to cover the material we do cover in depth. We still want students to do the same amount of work so that they show the same amount of learning growth as their skills are concerned. And then we can decide whether there was content that was missed that we need to address later. When we make this sort of shift, we have a very project-based curriculum, and so we have apparatus at the schools that we do not expect students to have at home. So we need to then go through and decide, are we using virtual replacements? Are we looking for low-cost lab kits? Are we changing what we're doing to take advantage of materials that students would naturally have at home? And this is one of the things that in the US, there's been a lot of flippant talk in the media about how everyone is homeschooling now. And that always causes me to pull my hair, because the difference between people who homeschool and people who send their kids to traditional school is that homeschoolers take full advantage of the uniqueness of place and the opportunities that are presented from it. So if you are suddenly not able to go somewhere, you look at what you are able to do and you focus on that, as opposed to schools which have so often a set curriculum, whether that's self-imposed or imposed by the state or some other ministry, that they feel compelled to take the students through. So they lose focus on learning and shift focus to compliance. I think here, the biggest challenge is, if you want to design an emergency system that can be widely deployed with the minimum requirements for technology and bandwidth and other things, such a system could be designed, but that takes time. That is not a thing that is rolled out immediately. The systems that we can roll out immediately will really depend on the resources that the school and the school's community have when the emergency strikes. So, upper mid-market schools can make the transition in a day to a week. Schools with fewer resources may take a month to make the shift. Schools with no resources may just decide that we will take school holidays early and hope that things go away and then we can just restore the status quo. But it is, there is so much more that could be done, but what we need to become clear on is, what is the goal? What are the objectives we're after? And then we can bring the tools to bear, and how do we achieve those?
Ray, thank you. And I just want to quickly take a moment to say thank you to attendees who are really vibrantly contributing today. Samir asks a really important question, and Emiliana, I want to come to you with this, which is, will the use of technology in classroom learning increase inequality in inequity? And broadly speaking, what can be done to mitigate that before it becomes too much of a problem?
Thank you for that question. We are seeing that, let's say, at least in the United States, we are seeing that some students who have access to technology are using the platforms and the learning opportunities much more than they were prior to the pandemic. And students who don't have such access, or who don't have the environment at home that allows them to devote the same amount of time, are being hurt, are using it. So we do think that there is a growing, let's say, divide between those who have access to technology and an environment at home that allows them to take advantage of it, and those who don't. And I can see that around the world, it's the same. If in the wealthiest countries in the world, it's already an issue of concern, it's something that obviously is going to be of greater concern in poorer countries. So yes.
Thank you. And Ali, Cindy, and I just want to echo what Ali has said. This topic needs more than one webinar. We agree. And there will be a second webinar on Wednesday addressing a particular issue. But I want to take a question that Valentina has asked from Paris. Learning as broader than school attendance, but as a character building experience, how can teachers take advantage of COVID-19 to build resilience? as a tool. And so how can we maximize from a pedagogical perspective this experience and this moment? So Dennis, if I could come to you with that question and see whether you've done anything around using the moment and the time to build a pedagogical resilience in young people, and how may you have done that?
I think that's an excellent question, and I think whether we have this intention or not, kids are being impacted by the pandemic in many different ways, and you will have different memories from this moment, from depending on the environment they are in, and if they are being able to have a teacher to help them navigate that. I think a lot of times, especially for younger kids, teachers serve as kind of part of their role model as well, and part of the key person. That's why even if the solution cannot be keeping life as usual with a virtual classroom for every school, which is unfeasible in most places, we should encourage communication between teachers and students. And we also, when we think about the back to school, I think it's important also that we think about the back to school with this, like, how can we discuss how different countries, how different cultures dealt with the pandemic? How can we discuss the inequality that is made so visible because of it? How can we discuss what were the experiences that each kid and student lived at their homes in this process, how their families process this? I think we're seeing this in companies and organizations, that we need to be much more open and ready to support psychologically, and with all the mental health solutions available. Our own staffs, we can only imagine what's the effect on children. So I think this is going to be a very important part of the coming back to school. If I could add just one quick comment on the whole issue of this, what Emiliana said about, even the best solutions now are more about urgency than about high quality, and I agree with that. I think we have to be urgent about putting in place a high quality possibility of including technology in education. Nothing will substitute teachers, and we're learning that the hard way. And a lot of parents who are now more involved with their kids' education are valuing teachers more and more. And I think that's great. I hope we leave the pandemic with that sense that teachers are really, really important. But it's really important that we think about, like, broadband connectivity, high-speed connectivity, that we think about access to data and access to devices as a right. As something, when President Obama launched the Connect Ed initiative in the US many years ago to connect all public schools to high-speed broadband, he said, we cannot go to a coffee house and not accept if they have Wi-Fi, but we send our kids to school and we don't even know what's going on there. So everywhere you go, the first question is there Wi-Fi? Can I use your Wi-Fi, right? And so how can we make sure that we are ready for the next problem? Because as Raymond said, we're seeing this in California with the fires, we're seeing with floods in many parts of the world. Disruption of the classroom is a new normal, and we have to be ready for that. And we also need to be ready to, inequality is there every single day, not only during the pandemic. So when this finishes, still families with more resources will be providing their kids more opportunity. And if in the short term technology increases the inequality, I think in the long run it has an incredible potential to decrease it by
Dennis,
allowing
thank
access
you so
to
much.
fantastic learning. So sorry for speaking too much.
No. Dennis, you're speaking so there's so much wisdom here, and Aqua and Daji in particular have mentioned points about internet connectivity and access to the internet, and how that is such a crucial component to even the conversation that we're having. Ray, if I can come to you, we've had some points made. So I think Livia mentioned in Colombia the use of TV broadcasting to reach students, WhatsApp, and some really good experience there. We've had Aqua talk about the need for different contexts, and Maria talked about the need for local governments, or actually Maria asked the question around local governments creating consortia to exchange experiences and best practices. Are we seeing similar efforts? So that's a question, but what I really wanted to ask you was a question here, which is, we are seeing an increased dependency on technology. Have have we mitigated against the impact that has from a mental health perspective, from a lifestyle imbalance perspective of what it means? I know many of us who've now changed our lives to be on Zoom think, people don't give you the time to breathe in between meetings that you may have had to physically travel. So there are consequences to going online. It would be great to get a sense from you, from the work that you've done, what considerations are given to online learning and the impact on students and teachers.
Yeah, I think the single most important thing that I've learned over the last 20 years is do not be anytime, anywhere. There is a reason why the sun sets. There is a reason why you need to sleep at the end of the day. Getting students to understand that instructors are available at these times, and if you have questions, you should try to get them out then. But don't send a question at 11 p.m. and expect an immediate response from your instructor. And really, to the instructors, don't respond to those questions, because it will encourage people to fall into a habit of continual partial attention. What you want to do is move away from that to sort of sharper, more focused periods of attention. Certainly spend less time in your online classes than you would have spent in your physical classes. Physical classes are tremendously inefficient, but it's a kind of inefficiency that we're very comfortable with. If you try to then have people come online for the same amount of time, they will be absolutely exhausted, and they will find themselves either paying attention the whole time and being exhausted, or not paying attention, in which case you're just not being efficient in the use of the resources. The mental health problems are profound, because, and one of the reasons why I have a strong, where possible, strong preference for synchronous types of online learning than asynchronous, is that in a synchronous environment, if a student fails to show up, you will notice that they are not there. More importantly, their friends will notice that they weren't there, and they will reach out. There's opportunities to catch problems before they happen. In an asynchronous environment, you will often find that someone isn't there because they haven't done anything, and unless your system is actively monitoring the lack of signal, it can be weeks before you notice someone is gone. And by that point, independent of what their mental health is, they may have completely fallen out of the school. I mean, anyone who has ever stopped playing an instrument understands what it is like to fall away from something like that. And so these are very important issues.
Right, thank you. And Nav, I'm going to come to you. So we have Alexander Stein, who is a private tutor teaching students of all grades and colleges, who's shared some experiences in terms of his own understanding and experiences of being an online tutor and shifting online. But there's one thing, an observation he makes right at the end, which is the stronger and healthier the student-teacher relationship was pre-COVID, the easier it became throughout the quarantine to teach and to train. Now, I want to ask you specifically, which is a question that Monica has asked, and Samia from Tunisia has also asked, which is, so Monica teaches in New York and has access to technology. Her greatest difficulty is testing and assessing and its integrity. What advice can you offer, or best practice can you share around making sure integrity of assessment, so that young people and students are not in any way discriminated or unfairly judged?
I mean, that's a really good question, thank you. And that's a very pertinent question coming to the end of the year. I do an Instagram live chat with my students, lunch with me once a month, and I had around 20 students separately asking me about testing. So this is not just something that teachers are thinking about, it's something students in primary and secondary school, middle and high, if you will, are asking this question. And let's look at it from the teacher point of view. First of all, testing is to serve a purpose. Otherwise, it doesn't need to be there. So it's a case of, in your school or in your subject, why are you testing? For what purpose? Is it testing for the sake of testing? And you can have over testing as well. Or is it to understand where the learning is at, whether that be formative or summative? So what we have done in our school is our summative assessments, we are deferring them to later. We have some specific reading assessments that we are doing through self-proctoring tools. Other than that, it's more hot and cold tasks to understand what the student understands about the particular key skill, some series of lessons, and then the hot task on the same one to see how they understood it, and then it's based on teacher judgment. Okay, so that's what we're doing here, as opposed to assessing and carrying on with our normal schedule, which will then put far more pressure on the students. Now, that works in most parts of the school, but however, if it's in particular year groups, for example, speaking from a UK curriculum point of view, the GCSEs and the A-levels, or the IGs and the IA levels, they've moved over to calculated grades. There's no examinations taking place. That was a significant task for us to understand how, because the information came from the exam boards later, of what that would look like. So again, it comes down to the purpose, why you're testing, what you're trying to find out. But again, communicate that with your students, who will actually be asking that question far more. And if the means to ask you is not there, don't think that because the signal is not from them, that it doesn't exist. You need to inform them and keep it transparent with parents.
Nav, thank you so much. We've just run out of time. So I have one question which I would love for you to answer in 15 seconds. This conversation is a big one. We know it is. This coming Wednesday, we're going to carry it on in a different context. So the question I have for everybody is from Toby, which I love. If there was one thing you would say from the COVID period, a key lesson from lockdown that you would want to say for the schooling system of the future, what would it be? So I am going to go in order of the way we spoke today. So Dennis, if I may come to you first.
That's a great question. And I think probably is how can we incorporate this possibility of using technology not as a substitute, but to extend learning? How can we think about more opportunities to connect with people from not only our classrooms, but all over the world, as we're seeing now? How can we explore the world more without the necessity or the resources for traveling? And how can we make it more a closer learning process that parents and kids can have together? How can we get and keep parents motivated and engaged, even when they are not the primary responsibles for their kids' academic education? So I think these are some of the learnings.
Dennis, thank you. Emiliana.
I totally agree with Dennis. So I'm going to go a different route, which is to say that I think I hope that as societies, we place an even higher value on our teachers and school leaders and the role that schools play in children's and students' lives. I think, one of the risks of the pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis around the world is that, again, education budgets may be slashed, and the teachers will again be, underpaid even more than before. And I think there's a real need to commit to supporting education systems and to, doing the things that Dennis said will also require additional investment.
Thank you. Ray.
The more that we can get our students to take responsibility for driving their own learning and shifting ourselves to supporting that, the more we will be able to tolerate the inability to bring all our students together at the same place and the same time without having the learning disrupted.
Fantastic. And last but no means least, Nav.
I want to tell you a little bit very quickly. I'm conscious he said 15 seconds. I've tried.
We've gone over now, so it's now 10 seconds.
Okay, so the reality of the situation is when I was growing up and whenever it snowed, it was called snow days, we never went to school. Over here in the UAE, whenever there's a sandstorm, sometimes schools might close, and when it rains, it affects the school. One thing I've realized is from the disruption of this pandemic and moving over to distance learning, learning will not be disrupted ever more. Because the reality is whenever there's a snow day or a sandstorm day or a rain day, you can continue with that learning virtually. So that's one of the things I'm really proud of in this time, is that we will have a lot more stamina and a catalyst to be able to continue with learning at home wherever appropriate or necessary. An example is ease of access. We had a parents' evening last week, and so many of them who were not able to get into school from their offices had access to the teachers, and they didn't have to wait in queues in lines, with another parent overlooking them over their head because they were over their 5-minute slot or 10-minute slot. Certain things like this, technology makes that accessible, and that is something I aim to segue on when we go back to bricks and mortar, if you will. So technology is not going away. It will be a new normal, which we've never come before.
Nav, Ray, Emiliana, Dennis, thank you for your incredible insights today. We know it was a big conversation to try and pack into an hour. We continue the conversation afterwards on our website and beyond. thank you again. It's been fantastic. Over to you, Emma.
So thank you to the panelists and thank you to our audience. And please join us on Wednesday to continue with this discussion about education. And we're going to explore how to support vulnerable young people to prevent a lost generation. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a great Sunday.